Tonight, imagine you've worked from sunrise until dusk in a medieval village. Your stomach aches with hunger as you finally sit beside a small fire, expecting a satisfying meal. But when a wooden bowl is placed before you, there is no roasted meat, no rich feast, and not even fresh bread. What you are about to eat kept millions alive for centuries. Yet most people today would struggle to finish a single bite. Let's quietly discover what medieval peasants really ate. For most medieval peasants, food was never about pleasure. Every meal was designed to provide enough energy for another exhausting day in the fields. Families depended on whatever they could grow, gather, or preserve through changing seasons. Luxury foods rarely appeared on their tables, and even simple ingredients were carefully measured because every loaf of bread and every handful of grain might determine whether a family survived the coming winter. Unlike the grand banquets shown in many films, the average peasant's table looked remarkably simple. A rough wooden bowl, a clay pot hanging above the fire, and coarse bread formed the center of daily life. Meals changed with the seasons rather than personal choice. If the harvest was poor, the table became emptier. If the harvest was generous, families quietly celebrated with slightly larger portions instead of expensive delicacies. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal, but it was very different from the soft white loaves many people enjoy today. Most peasants baked dark bread made from rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains because wheat remained expensive. The texture was dense, the flavor earthy, and each loaf reflected the quality of that year's harvest. Even stale bread was rarely wasted, as every crumb carried real value in everyday medieval life. As evening settled over the village, the smell of a simmering pot slowly filled the small cottage. Inside, vegetables, herbs, and grains cooked together into a simple meal known as pottage. There was no fixed recipe because every family used whatever ingredients were available that day. One bowl might contain onions and cabbage, while another held beans or turnips, making every pot a quiet reflection of the changing seasons. Fresh vegetables appeared on the table whenever the season allowed. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, and turnips were among the most common crops. Families planted them in small kitchen gardens beside their cottages, making these humble vegetables an essential part of everyday survival. Their flavors were simple, yet they provided valuable nourishment throughout much of the year. Meat was far less common than many people imagine. Most peasants could not afford to slaughter healthy animals because they were more valuable alive. Chickens produced eggs, cows gave milk, and pigs could be raised for future needs. For many families, meat appeared only during festivals, weddings, or after an animal could no longer work or produce food. Herbs added welcome flavor to otherwise plain meals. Parsley, sage, thyme, mint, and dill grew easily in cottage gardens and were gathered fresh whenever needed. Besides improving taste, many people believed these plants supported good health and digestion. Even the simplest bowl of pottage became more enjoyable with a handful of fragrant herbs picked just outside the door. Every meal depended upon the changing seasons. Summer brought fresh vegetables and herbs. Autumn filled storage baskets with grains and beans, while winter forced families to rely upon dried foods kept from earlier harvests. During difficult years, supplies became dangerously low before spring arrived, making careful planning just as important as successful farming throughout medieval life. As darkness settled outside, the family gathered quietly around the fire with wooden bowls resting in their hands. Conversation remained gentle after a long day of labor, while the warm pottage offered comfort more than excitement. Though the meal seemed modest by modern standards, it represented another day survived together, a quiet victory repeated countless times across medieval Europe. A successful harvest could mean comfort for a few precious months, But one season of heavy rain, drought, or crop disease threatened an entire village. Peasant families watched the weather with constant concern because their survival depended upon healthy fields. Every loaf of bread, every handful of oats, and every bowl of pottage reflected months of uncertain labor, reminding them that nature alone often decided whether they would eat well or face another hungry winter. Salt was among the most valuable supplies inside a peasant household. It preserved meat, fish, and even certain vegetables long after harvest season had ended. Families used it sparingly because obtaining more was expensive and often difficult. A careless waste of salt could mean spoiled food during winter, turning a simple kitchen ingredient into one of the most trusted tools for survival throughout medieval village life. Fresh fruit was welcomed whenever the seasons allowed. Apples, pears, plums, blackberries, and wild berries added welcome variety to otherwise simple meals. During harvest time, families dried some fruit or stored it carefully for colder months ahead. Sweet flavors were uncommon in a peasant's daily diet, making every ripe apple or handful of berries feel like a quiet gift from the surrounding countryside. Meals were usually shared from a single cooking pot placed near the center of the table or beside the fire. Wooden bowls and simple spoons were common, while slices of coarse bread often served as both food and plate. These quiet family meals offered more than nourishment. They brought everyone together after long hours of labor, creating rare moments of warmth, conversation, and comfort before another demanding day arrived. As darkness settled over the fields, the cooking fire slowly faded into glowing embers. Tomorrow's bread dough rested beneath a cloth while the family prepared for another sunrise of hard work. Their supper had been simple, filling, and carefully stretched to feed every mouth inside the cottage. Though modest by modern standards, these humble meals gave medieval peasants the strength to endure another day in an uncertain world. For medieval peasants, wasting food was almost unthinkable. Every crust of bread, every spoonful of pottage, and every dried bean represented weeks of hard labor in the fields. Leftovers were carefully saved for the following day or mixed into another meal. Even bones were boiled to make broth whenever possible. Nothing was discarded unless it had completely lost its usefulness, because every bite could help a family survive another difficult season. Children learned about food from an early age by helping their parents plant seeds, gather vegetables, grind grain, and carry water. They quickly understood that every meal depended upon patience and hard work rather than luck. These daily lessons shaped their respect for even the simplest foods. A worn loaf of bread or a full bowl of pottage was never taken for granted inside a medieval peasant household. Religion also influenced the peasant's diet throughout the year. On many church fasting days, families avoided meat and instead ate simple meals made with grains, vegetables, fish, or beans. These traditions were followed across much of medieval Europe and became part of everyday life. The changing rhythm of religious festivals quietly shaped not only worship but also what appeared on the dinner table from one season to the next. When harvests were generous, families carefully stored grain inside wooden bins and vegetables in cool cellars to prepare for winter. They understood that abundance never lasted forever. A full storehouse brought comfort, but everyone knew the food must be stretched over many months. Careful planning, patience, and discipline often meant the difference between reaching spring safely or facing the terrible reality of hunger before winter ended. As the cottage grows quiet and the fire settles into glowing embers, the day's final meal becomes a memory. The wooden bowls are cleaned, tomorrow's work awaits with the sunrise, and another peaceful night blankets the medieval village. Though their food was humble, it sustained generations of hard-working people whose simple meals quietly shaped the history of Europe. Our journey will continue as we discover the foods that truly kept medieval life alive. If you had visited a medieval village before sunrise, one of the first smells filling the cool morning air would have been fresh bread baking inside a small clay oven. Bread was not simply another food. It was the heart of nearly every meal, eaten from childhood until old age. A family might survive without meat for weeks, but life without bread was almost impossible. Every loaf represented months of farming, careful grinding, patient baking, and the hope of another day without hunger. The bread eaten by most peasants looked very different from the soft white loaves found in modern bakeries. It was usually baked from rye, barley, oats, or mixed grains because wheat remained costly and was often reserved for wealthier families. These darker loaves were dense, firm, and filling, providing the energy needed for long hours of physical labor. Their rough texture reflected the realities of medieval farming and the simple ingredients available throughout the countryside. Growing grain demanded patience from the very beginning. Fields were plowed with wooden tools pulled by oxen. Seeds were scattered by hand, and every harvest depended upon favorable weather. Too much rain could destroy the crop, while long periods without rainfall left the earth dry and unproductive. After months of exhausting work, a successful harvest meant bread on the table. A failed harvest often meant hunger that lasted through the long winter months ahead. After harvesting, the grain had to be carried to the village mill, where large stone wheels slowly crushed it into flour. This process required both time and physical effort, and many peasants paid the local miller for his service. The flour was rarely smooth because tiny pieces of bran remained mixed inside. Although coarse by modern standards, this hearty flour produced bread that filled empty stomachs and sustained hard-working families throughout the year. Once the flour returned home, it was carefully mixed with water and a small amount of salt before being kneaded into dough by hand. Some families saved a little fermented dough from the previous baking to help the next loaf rise naturally. After hours of waiting, the bread was baked inside a hot clay oven until a thick, dark crust formed. The finished loaf became the centerpiece of nearly every meal shared around the family table. Fresh bread rarely stayed untouched for long inside a peasant home. A newly baked loaf often served the family for several days, gradually becoming harder with time. Instead of throwing it away, stale bread was softened in warm pottage, dipped into broth, or broken into smaller pieces for later meals. Every crumb carried value because producing a single loaf required months of farming, harvesting, grinding, and baking, making waste almost unthinkable. Not every loaf looked the same. During years of poor harvest, families stretched their flour by mixing it with beans, peas, chestnuts, or even ground acorns when food became scarce. These substitutes changed both the taste and texture of the bread, but they allowed precious grain supplies to last longer. The loaf on a family's table often revealed whether that year had brought abundance, hardship, or the constant fear of an empty storehouse. Bread also reflected social differences throughout medieval Europe. Wealthy nobles enjoyed soft white bread made from finely sifted wheat flour, while ordinary peasants relied upon darker loaves containing coarse grains and bran. The difference was immediately visible, even before the first bite. Simply by looking at a person's bread, neighbors could often guess whether they belonged to a prosperous household or spent each day working the village fields. Children often carried small pieces of bread while helping their parents with daily chores around the farm. It was easy to transport, filling enough to satisfy hunger, and required no special preparation before eating. Combined with cheese, onions, or a bowl of pottage, bread formed a simple meal that provided strength for long hours of labor. Its dependable nature made it the single most important food in the life of nearly every peasant family. As evening settled across the countryside, another loaf rested beside the glowing hearth, ready to feed the household the following day. Its rough crust and dense texture may seem ordinary today, yet for medieval peasants it represented security, survival, and the reward for months of difficult work. Before we leave the village bakery behind, we begin to understand why bread was never simply food. It was the foundation upon which everyday medieval life quietly depended. Baking bread was rarely the work of one person alone. Before sunrise, family members often shared the task of grinding grain, kneading dough, gathering firewood, and heating the village oven. Each pair of hands helped turn a simple mixture of flour and water into the food that sustained everyone. This daily routine strengthened family life and reminded every generation that survival depended upon working patiently together. The village baker held an important place within medieval society. Many peasants prepared their dough at home, but brought it to a shed oven because building a private one required more money than most families possessed. The baker carefully watched the heat, arranged the loaves, and ensured they cooked evenly. A successful baking day meant dozens of households would return home carrying warm bread for the days ahead. Bread even became a symbol of gratitude and hospitality. When neighbors visited after a successful harvest or helped during difficult times, sharing a fresh loaf expressed friendship without using words. Though simple, this small act reflected trust and generosity within the community. Offering bread around a wooden table reminded everyone that cooperation often mattered just as much as a plentiful harvest. Some loaves lasted only a day, while others were baked harder so they could remain edible much longer. These firm loaves were often softened in soup or pottage before eating. Their long shelf life made them especially valuable during winter, when fresh baking became less frequent. Every household learned different methods to keep bread useful for as many days as possible without wasting a single piece. As another baking day quietly came to an end, the comforting aroma of warm bread drifted through the narrow streets of the village. For medieval peasants, this familiar scent brought reassurance after long hours of labor. A full basket of bread meant tomorrow's meals were secure, at least for a little while. Before exploring other everyday foods, we can now understand why bread truly became the foundation of medieval life. For many medieval families, the day's first and last meal both included bread. A thick slice dipped into warm pottage or eaten with a little cheese could satisfy hunger for hours. It was simple, dependable, and available almost every day when the harvest had been kind. More than any other food, bread offered a sense of stability in a world where weather, disease, and poor harvest could change a family's future without warning. Not every loaf came from the same grain. Northern Europe relied heavily on rye and oats because they grew well in colder climates, while southern regions produced more wheat where conditions allowed. Local weather, soil, and farming traditions shaped the bread people baked. By tasting a loaf, an experienced traveler could often guess the region where it had been made, long before reaching the next village. During years of famine, bread became smaller, darker, and less nutritious as families mixed flour with whatever edible plants they could gather. Peas, beans, chestnuts, or even ground tree bark were sometimes added to stretch precious grain supplies. These emergency loaves filled empty stomachs, but rarely satisfied true hunger. They stand as a quiet reminder of how closely survival depended upon the success of each annual harvest. Despite its humble appearance, bread shaped every stage of medieval life. Farmers grew the grain, millers ground it into flour, bakers transformed it into loaves, and families shared it around the evening fire. Countless hands worked together before a single slice reached the table. This simple food connected entire communities, making bread not only nourishment, but also a symbol of cooperation, labor, and daily survival. As the warm scent of freshly baked bread slowly fades into the quiet evening air, we leave the village bakery behind and continue our peaceful journey through medieval life. Our next chapter will explore another meal found almost every day inside a peasant's home, a slow-cooked dish that quietly simmered above the fire from morning until night. Its name was pottage, and it fed generations across medieval Europe. Imagine returning home after 12 exhausting hours in the fields. The sun has disappeared, your hands ache from labor, and the cold evening air follows you into a tiny wooden cottage. Waiting above the glowing fire is a black iron pot that has quietly simmered since dawn. Inside is a meal called pottage. It may look ordinary today, but for nearly every medieval peasant, this single pot determined whether the family ended the day satisfied or went to bed hungry. Pottage was not a recipe, but a way of cooking. Every morning, vegetables, grains, herbs, and whatever food remained from previous meals were placed into one large pot above the fire. As the hours passed, fresh ingredients could be added whenever they became available. The result was a thick and nourishing stew that slowly changed throughout the day, making every family's pottage slightly different from every other household in the village. One of the remarkable qualities of pottage was its ability to waste almost nothing. A stale piece of bread, yesterday's onions, a handful of beans, or a few cabbage leaves could all be added to the same pot. If someone gathered fresh herbs on the walk home, they joined the stew as well. This careful use of every available ingredient allowed families to stretch limited food supplies while creating filling meals from the simplest resources. The pot itself rarely became completely empty. Before serving supper, many families intentionally left a small amount inside. The following morning, fresh water, grains, and vegetables were added, allowing the stew to continue cooking for another day. In some cottages, this same cooking pot remained in constant use for weeks, creating a meal that quietly evolved with every passing season and every ingredient gathered from the surrounding countryside. Although pottage appeared simple, its flavor constantly changed with the seasons. Spring brought tender greens and wild herbs. Summer added peas and onions. Autumn offered beans and turnips, while winter depended upon dried vegetables carefully stored months before. No written recipe existed because nature decided what entered the pot. Every bowl became a quiet reflection of the land, the weather, and the family's fortune during that particular year. The gentle bubbling sound of pottage became one of the most familiar sounds inside a medieval cottage. Hanging above the fire from morning until evening, The heavy iron pot filled the room with the comforting aroma of onions, herbs, and slowly cooked grains. Unlike modern meals prepared in minutes, pottage rewarded patience. Every passing hour allowed the flavors to blend together, creating a warm and satisfying meal after a long day of exhausting labor. No two villages prepared pottage in exactly the same way. Families living near forests often added wild mushrooms or hazelnuts, while those beside rivers sometimes included small freshwater fish. In farming regions, beans, peas, and cabbage were more common. The surrounding landscape quietly shaped every meal, making each bowl a reflection of local traditions, seasonal harvests, and the natural resources available just beyond the village fields. Children often gathered small bundles of herbs while helping their parents with daily chores. Wild parsley, sorrel, nettles, and thyme were carefully collected and carried home to enrich the evening meal. These simple plants added fresh flavors and important nutrients without costing a single coin. Every successful gathering trip helped stretch the family's food supply while bringing a welcome taste of the countryside into the cooking pot. Even visitors could usually expect a bowl of pottage when welcomed into a peasant's home. Although the meal was humble, sharing it reflected generosity and community rather than wealth. A traveler might receive a wooden bowl, a slice of coarse bread, and a place beside the warm fire. In a world where few families possessed great riches, offering simple food remained one of the kindest ways to show hospitality and respect. As darkness settled over the village, the final bowls of pottage were quietly shared before the fire slowly burned low. Tomorrow morning, the same pot would hang above the flames once again, beginning another day's gentle simmer. This humble meal asked for little, wasted almost nothing, and nourished countless generations. More than food alone, pottage became a quiet symbol of endurance, resourcefulness, and everyday life throughout medieval Europe. For elderly villagers, pottage offered another important advantage. After years of hard labor, many could no longer chew coarse bread or tough meat with ease. A bowl of slow-cooked stew was soft, warm, and gentle enough for almost everyone to enjoy. It nourished children, adults, and the elderly alike, making it one of the few meals that truly suited every member of a medieval household without requiring separate preparation. The heavy cooking pot often became one of the family's most treasured possessions. Made from iron or thick clay, it remained suspended above the hearth day after day, quietly serving every season of life. Weddings, births, harsh winters, and successful harvests were all accompanied by meals prepared inside the same faithful vessel. Over many years, the pot became more than a kitchen tool. It became a silent witness to the family's entire history. The rich aroma rising from the simmering stew drifted beyond the cottage door and into the narrow village paths. Passing neighbors immediately recognized the familiar scent of onions, herbs, and grains cooking together. Although every household used slightly different ingredients, the comforting smell of pottage united the community. It quietly announced that another evening meal was nearly ready after a long day of labor beneath the open sky. Unlike elaborate feasts prepared for nobles, pottage required patience rather than expensive ingredients. A gentle fire, careful stirring, and many hours of slow cooking transformed simple vegetables and grains into a nourishing meal. Time itself became one of the recipe's most valuable ingredients. The longer the stew simmered, the richer its flavor became, rewarding families willing to wait while the day's work slowly came to an end. As another peaceful evening settled across the medieval countryside, the final bowls of pottage, warm tired hands gathered around the glowing hearth. Outside, darkness covered the fields, while inside, quiet conversation faded into comfortable silence. Tomorrow the same pot would hang above the fire once again, continuing a tradition repeated for countless generations. Few meals in history carried such humble simplicity while quietly sustaining millions of ordinary lives. When unexpected guests arrived, the family rarely prepared a completely different meal. Instead, a little more water, a handful of vegetables, or extra grain was added to the simmering pottage. In this simple way, the same pot could feed more people without wasting precious supplies. The meal reflected an important medieval belief that generosity did not require wealth. Sometimes, sharing even a humble bowl of stew was the greatest kindness a family could offer. The slow rhythm of making pottage matched the rhythm of medieval life itself. While the stew quietly simmered, families repaired clothing, prepared tools, cared for animals, or rested after working the fields. There was no rush, no complicated recipe, and no expensive ingredients to measure. The fire did most of the work, allowing time itself to transform simple foods into a nourishing supper shared together beneath a humble wooden roof. Even during difficult winters, the familiar sight of the cooking pot hanging above the hearth brought quiet reassurance. Supplies might be limited, yet as long as a few vegetables, grains, or dried beans remained, the family could prepare another warm meal. The gentle steam rising into the cottage reminded everyone that comfort was sometimes found not in abundance, but in the simple promise of food waiting at the end of a long day. Modern kitchens offer endless recipes and countless ingredients, yet the medieval cooking pot tells a different story. It reminds us that creativity often grows from necessity rather than luxury. With only a few basic foods, peasant families created meals that nourished generations. Their resourcefulness turned ordinary ingredients into daily survival, proving that patience and careful planning were just as valuable as the food itself. As the last spoonful of pottage disappears from the wooden bowl, the cottage grows quiet once more. Outside, the stars shine above peaceful fields, while inside, tomorrow's firewood waits beside the hearth. The faithful cooking pot will soon begin another day of gentle simmering. Our journey now continues beyond this comforting meal, as we discover what medieval peasants truly drank when clean, fresh water could not always be trusted. Imagine standing beside a quiet medieval stream after hours of working beneath the summer sun. You kneel, hoping for a refreshing drink, yet the villagers gently stop you. Instead of offering cool water, they hand you a wooden cup filled with weak ale. To modern eyes, the choice seems surprising. Why would ordinary peasants drink ale instead of water? The answer begins with a hidden danger flowing through many medieval wells, rivers, and village ponds. Contrary to popular belief, medieval people did drink water, but they chose its source with great care. Fresh springs, deep wells, and clean mountain streams were usually trusted when available. The real danger came from water standing near homes, animals, or waste. Without understanding bacteria or disease, Villagers still recognized that some water caused sickness, while other sources appeared much safer through years of careful observation. Small ale became one of the most common drinks in medieval villages because it contained very little alcohol and was brewed for everyday use. Children, adults, and elderly family members often drank it with meals. During brewing, boiling the liquid helped reduce harmful contamination, making small ale a dependable choice when the safety of nearby water remained uncertain. It tasted mild and provided nourishment alongside daily meals. Brewing ale was as familiar to many households as baking bread. Grain, water, and careful patience transformed simple ingredients into a drink that could be stored for days without spoiling quickly. Every family followed traditions passed through generations, adjusting recipes according to local grain and available herbs. The gentle scent of brewing often filled the cottage, becoming another familiar rhythm of everyday medieval life. A wooden cup of small ale accompanied countless meals throughout the year. It was served beside coarse bread, warm pottage, or simple vegetables gathered from the garden. Few families considered it a luxury. Instead, it formed an ordinary part of daily survival, offering comfort after long hours in the fields. As we continue our journey, we will discover that medieval drinking habits were far more practical and thoughtful than many modern myths suggest. Milk also appeared on many peasant tables, though not every family enjoyed it every day. Cows and goats produced milk mainly during certain seasons, and much of it was quickly turned into cheese or butter before it spoiled. Fresh milk was usually consumed soon after milking, because families had no reliable way to keep it cold. Every drop was valued, making dairy an important but carefully managed part of the medieval diet. Buttermilk became another familiar drink after butter was made by churning fresh cream. Cool, slightly sour, and refreshing after long hours of labor, it provided valuable nourishment without wasting any part of the milk. Nothing was thrown away if it could still be used. This careful habit reflected the practical mindset of medieval peasants, who learned that survival often depended upon making the most of every available resource. During harvest season, workers often carried small wooden flasks containing water or weak ale into the fields. Walking back to the village for a drink wasted precious time during the busiest weeks of the year. These simple containers allowed farmers to remain at work from sunrise until evening. Even something as ordinary as carrying a drink reflected the careful planning required to make each day's labor as productive as possible. Travelers crossing medieval Europe also paid close attention to where they found water. Inns, monasteries, and villages with trusted wells became welcome places to rest before continuing their journey. Experienced travelers avoided drinking from stagnant ponds whenever possible, relying instead on flowing springs or drinks prepared by local households. These practical choices often made long journeys safer, even without understanding the science behind disease. As another peaceful evening settled across the village, wooden cups were quietly placed beside bowls of warm pottage and fresh bread, whether filled with clean water, small ale, or buttermilk. Each drink reflected careful choices shaped by experience rather than modern science. Their daily habits remind us that medieval peasants constantly adapted to the world around them, using observation and tradition to protect their families as best they could. Every season brought different challenges to finding safe drinking water. During dry summers, wells sometimes produced less water, forcing villagers to walk farther in search of fresh springs. Heavy autumn rains could muddy streams and ponds, making them less appealing for daily use. Through long experience, families learned which sources remained dependable throughout the year, passing this practical knowledge from parents to children across countless generations. Monasteries often became trusted places for weary travelers seeking clean water and a simple meal. Many monasteries carefully maintained deep wells or natural springs within their grounds, providing a safer source than stagnant ponds nearby. Visitors were welcomed with quiet hospitality, receiving fresh water, bread, or weak ale before continuing their journey. These peaceful communities offered comfort as well as practical knowledge about finding reliable drinking water. Even the wooden cups used for drinking reflected the simplicity of medieval life. Crafted by local woodworkers from oak, ash, or beech, they were sturdy enough for everyday use and easily repaired when damaged. Each family owned only a few, yet they were carefully maintained for many years. Though plain in appearance, these humble cups became familiar companions at every meal shared beside the glowing evening hearth. For medieval peasants, choosing what to drink was rarely about preference. It was a practical decision shaped by experience, local tradition, and the changing seasons. Whether drawing water from a trusted spring or sharing a cup of small ale, every choice reflected generations of careful observation. Without scientific knowledge, they relied upon wisdom gained through everyday life, quietly adapting to the challenges surrounding their village. As another peaceful day comes to an end, the final wooden cups are placed beside empty bowls while the cooking fire slowly settles into glowing embers. Outside, the village grows silent beneath the evening sky, and tomorrow's work already waits beyond the fields. Our journey now continues beyond the drinks of medieval life as we discover the rare occasions when ordinary peasants could finally enjoy the taste of meat. During long days of harvesting, drinking enough became just as important as gathering grain before the weather changed. Farmers paused only briefly, lifting wooden cups or small flasks before returning to their work beneath the sun. Whether filled with cool spring water or mild ale, every drink restored enough strength to continue. These quiet moments of rest became part of the daily rhythm that shaped life across medieval fields. Even children quickly learned which wells produced the clearest water and which ponds were best avoided after heavy rain. This knowledge was rarely written down in books. Instead, it passed naturally from parents and grandparents through everyday conversation and experience. Long before modern science explained contamination, medieval families relied upon careful observation, remembering the places that had kept their communities healthy for generations. A traveler arriving in an unfamiliar village often asked the same practical question before anything else. Where could safe drinking water be found? The answer frequently led them toward a trusted spring, a monastery well, or a welcoming household known for brewing fresh small ale. Finding a dependable drink offered reassurance after miles of difficult roads, making local knowledge one of the greatest comforts for people journeying across medieval Europe. Looking back today, medieval drinking habits reveal far more wisdom than many modern myths suggest. Although people lack knowledge of bacteria or microscopic disease, they observed patterns with remarkable care. Over generations, These observations shaped practical customs that reduced unnecessary risks. Their choices remind us that experience, patience, and shared community knowledge often became valuable guides in a world where scientific explanations had yet to exist. As the last wooden cup is quietly placed upon the table and the evening fire begins to fade, another peaceful day draws to a close inside the medieval cottage. Tomorrow will bring fresh work, familiar meals, and new challenges shaped by the seasons. Our gentle journey now continues to one of the rarest pleasures in a peasant's life, the precious occasions when meat finally appeared on the family table after months of waiting. Imagine smelling the rich aroma of roasted meat drifting through a medieval village. Your stomach tightens with hunger, but the meal is not meant for you. It comes from the manor house, where a noble family prepares for a grand feast. Back inside your small cottage, your supper remains a simple bowl of pottage and dark bread. Why did ordinary peasants almost never eat meat? Tonight, we quietly uncover one of medieval life's greatest food myths. Many people imagine medieval peasants enjoying roasted chickens or fresh pork whenever they wished. The truth was far quieter and far more difficult. Most families owned only a few animals, and those animals were too valuable to eat. A cow provided milk, chickens laid eggs, and sheep produced wool year after year. Slaughtering a healthy animal meant losing food and income that could support the family for many seasons. Pigs were among the most valuable animals a peasant could raise. They wandered through nearby forests searching for acorns, roots, and fallen fruit with little help from their owners. Yet even pigs were rarely slaughtered before late autumn. Families waited until colder weather arrived, preserving the meat with salt and smoke, so it could last through the long winter. Every decision required careful planning because one mistake could leave a household hungry for months. Fresh meat appeared only on rare occasions for most medieval peasants. Weddings, harvest celebrations, Christmas, Easter, or other important religious festivals sometimes brought a small serving of pork, chicken, or salted beef. These meals became treasured memories because they broke the routine of bread and pottage. Children especially looked forward to such days, knowing they might not taste meat again for many weeks, or even several months. Even when meat was available, nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled into nourishing broth. Animal fat was saved for cooking, and every usable piece found a purpose. A single chicken or pig had to feed an entire household for as long as possible. This careful respect for food reflected the realities of medieval survival, where every meal depended upon patience, preparation, and the hope that next year's harvest would once again be generous. Hunting wild deer or boar may sound like an easy solution to hunger, but for most peasants it was forbidden by law. Forests surrounding castles often belonged to local nobles, and the animals living there were carefully protected for aristocratic hunting parties. A hungry villager caught taking a single deer could face severe punishment. These strict hunting laws made meat even rarer for ordinary families struggling to survive. Fish became an important substitute whenever meat was unavailable or forbidden during religious fasting. Families living near rivers caught perch, pike, trout, or eels using simple nets and handmade traps. Coastal villages relied on herring and cod, preserving them with salt for future meals. Although fish appeared more often than meat in some regions, successful catches still depended upon weather, season, and a little good fortune. When a pig was finally slaughtered, the entire village often joined together to help prepare it before anything spoiled. Meat was sorted, smoked, or hung inside cool storage areas for the months ahead. Sausages were carefully filled, while fat became cooking lard. Every useful part found a purpose because replacing such valuable food would not be easy. This shared work strengthened both survival and the bonds between neighboring families. Children remembered feast days for many years because those occasions brought flavors rarely enjoyed during ordinary life. A small piece of roasted pork or chicken tasted extraordinary after months of eating bread, vegetables, and pottage. These meals were never rushed. Families gathered beside the fire, shared stories, offered thanks, and quietly appreciated the unusual abundance before returning to their familiar daily routine the following morning. As another peaceful evening settles across the medieval countryside, the aroma of roasted meat slowly fades, replaced once again by the familiar scent of bread and simmering pottage. Rare though it was, meat represented celebration, patience, and careful planning rather than everyday comfort. Its scarcity reminds us that medieval survival depended not upon luxury, but upon making the most of simple foods available throughout the changing seasons. Winter became the season when carefully preserved meat proved its greatest value. Months earlier, families had sorted pork, smoked sausages, and stored every usable piece inside cool sheds or hanging racks. These supplies were never eaten carelessly. Each portion was measured with patience, ensuring the household had enough food until spring returned and fresh crops slowly began growing once again across the surrounding fields. Even the smallest piece of meat could completely change the flavor of a simple meal. A few slices of salted pork simmering inside a pot of cabbage, beans, or pottage added richness that vegetables alone could never provide. The meat was stretched across several meals rather than eaten all at once. In this way, one carefully preserved cut could nourish an entire family for many days through the cold season. Feast days brought rare excitement to medieval villages because familiar meals briefly gave way to special foods. Church celebrations, weddings, and harvest festivals sometimes filled the air with the scent of roasting meat. Children watched eagerly while adults prepared meals they enjoyed only a few times each year. These occasions created lasting memories, not because the food was extravagant, but because such abundance appeared so rarely in ordinary life. Looking back from today, it is easy to assume medieval peasants constantly dreamed about eating more meat. Yet many accepted their simple diet as an ordinary part of life. Bread, vegetables, pottage, and small amounts of dairy remained the true foundation of everyday meals. Meat represented celebration rather than necessity, reminding us that survival depended far more upon reliable harvests than upon rare moments of luxury. As another peaceful evening settles across the quiet village, the final pieces of preserved meat are carefully returned to storage for another day. Nothing is wasted, nothing is hurried, and tomorrow's meals are already being planned beside the glowing fire. Our gentle journey now moves beyond rare feasts as we step into the small kitchen gardens, where humble vegetables and fragrant herbs quietly sustained medieval families throughout the changing seasons. When a family finally shared a meal containing meat, everyone understood its value long before the first bite. The food had been earned through months of careful planning, raising animals, preserving supplies, and waiting for the right season. Children learned to eat slowly, while adults quietly appreciated the rare comfort before them. These simple meals became treasured memories, reminding every generation that abundance was never something to expect. Nothing from a slaughtered animal was considered useless. Bones were simmered into nourishing broth. Hides became leather. Fat was rendered into cooking lard or candles, and even smaller scraps found their way into stews or sausages. Medieval households practiced remarkable resourcefulness because replacing valuable food demanded months of work. Every part served a purpose, reflecting a way of life built upon patience, gratitude, and careful preparation. As autumn slowly covered the countryside with golden leaves, villages entered one of their busiest seasons. Families worked together to preserve enough food before winter arrived. Smokehouses filled with hanging meat. Salted barrels were carefully sealed, and every storage shelf was checked again and again. These quiet preparations brought peace of mind, offering hope that the household would remain well fed until warmer days returned. Looking back across the centuries, it becomes clear that meat represented far more than nourishment. It symbolized successful harvests, healthy livestock, and months of thoughtful planning. A single shared meal carried the combined efforts of farmers, shepherds, and entire families working together. Perhaps that is why even the smallest portion was received with quiet gratitude, making each feast a gentle reminder of how precious simple comforts truly were. Now the last embers of the evening fire glow softly beneath the cooking pot, while the village settles into peaceful silence. The rare feast has ended, and tomorrow the familiar meals of bread, vegetables, and pottage will quietly return. As we continue our journey through medieval life, we leave these treasured moments behind and step into the small kitchen gardens where humble crops and fragrant herbs faithfully sustain generations of hard-working peasants. Imagine opening the small wooden gate beside a medieval cottage just after sunrise. Before you lies not a grand estate, but a modest kitchen garden carefully tended by the family throughout the year. Every cabbage, onion, bean, and herb growing in the rich soil could mean the difference between comfort and hunger. Long before supermarkets existed, this quiet patch of earth became one of the most valuable places in every peasant's daily life. Unlike the large fields reserved for grain, the kitchen garden stood only a few steps from the cottage door. Here, families planted vegetables that could be harvested quickly and used in everyday meals. Cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, and turnips filled the narrow rows, each chosen because they grew reliably in the local climate. Every morning, someone visited the garden, quietly checking which crops were ready to gather before preparing the day's meals. Herbs occupied a special corner of nearly every medieval garden. Sage, parsley, thyme, mint, dill, and fennel added welcome flavor to simple dishes while also serving traditional household remedies. Though villagers knew nothing about vitamins or nutrition, generations of experience taught them which plants eased stomach aches, freshened meals, or helped preserve food. These fragrant herbs quietly became trusted companions in both the kitchen and the home. Every family member helped care for the garden throughout the changing seasons. Children carried water from nearby wells. Parents loosened the soil with simple wooden tools, and grandparents carefully removed weeds while sharing advice learned over many decades. The garden demanded constant attention, yet its rewards appeared one harvest at a time. Every healthy plant represented another small victory against hunger in the uncertain world of medieval farming. As evening approached, fresh vegetables gathered from the garden were carried into the cottage and added to the familiar cooking pot above the fire. A handful of onions, tender cabbage leaves, beans, or fragrant herbs transformed ordinary pottage into a nourishing meal. Though these ingredients seemed humble, they quietly sustained millions of medieval peasants. Tomorrow, we will look more closely at how each vegetable shaped everyday life across the countryside. Cabbage became one of the most dependable vegetables in medieval Europe because it grew well in many climates and remained edible long after harvest. Families cooked it into pottage, mixed it with beans, or preserved it for colder months. Its sturdy leaves filled hungry stomachs when little else remained. Though simple in appearance, cabbage quietly earned a place as one of the most valuable crops in every peasant's kitchen garden. Onions and leeks appeared in nearly every medieval meal, adding gentle flavor to soups, stews, and coarse bread. They were easy to grow, stored well after harvest, and survived through much of the winter when fresh vegetables became scarce. Even the smallest handful could transform a plain pot of grains into something warm and satisfying. Their familiar aroma became one of the defining scents inside countless medieval cottages. Beans and peas supplied valuable nourishment when meat was unavailable, which was true for most days of the year. They were dried after harvest and stored in cloth sacks or wooden barrels until needed. During winter, these humble crops returned to the cooking pot, swelling slowly as they simmered beside the fire. Their reliability made them essential companions to bread and pottage throughout medieval village life. Many families planted herbs not only for cooking, but also to attract helpful insects and protect nearby vegetables from pests. Although they did not understand modern biology, generations of observation taught them which plants grew well together. This quiet knowledge passed from parents to children, helping gardens remain productive year after year. Nature itself became their teacher, offering practical lessons through careful watching rather than written books. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the fields, the kitchen garden rested in peaceful silence after another day of quiet care. Fresh vegetables gathered that evening would soon become tomorrow's meals, while young seedlings continued growing beneath the cool night air. These modest gardens asked for patience instead of wealth, yet they rewarded hardworking families with the steady nourishment that helped sustain medieval life through every changing season. Turnips became one of the quiet heroes of the medieval garden. They grew quickly, survived cool weather, and could remain buried in the ground until needed. Their roots were boiled into pottage, while the tender green leaves also found a place on the family table. During harsh winters, when fresh vegetables became difficult to find, turnips often provided the steady nourishment that helped ordinary families endure another cold season together. The kitchen garden constantly changed with the rhythm of the seasons. Spring brought fresh shoots pushing through the soil. Summer filled every corner with green leaves. Autumn rewarded months of patient care with baskets of vegetables. and winter left only carefully stored crops behind. Medieval peasants understood these natural cycles better than anyone. Their lives moved quietly alongside the changing earth, never rushing the pace of nature. Seeds themselves were among a family's most valuable possessions. After each successful harvest, the healthiest plants were chosen to provide seeds for the following year. These small treasures were carefully dried and protected from dampness, insects, and hungry mice. Losing them meant risking the next harvest before it had even begun. Every planting season, therefore, carried the hopes of an entire household within a handful of tiny seeds. Many medieval gardens were enclosed by woven fences or thick hedges that helped keep wandering chickens, pigs, goats, and wild rabbits away from delicate crops. Building these simple barriers required time and steady effort, yet they protected months of careful work. Every cabbage leaf saved from hungry animals brought another meal closer to the family table, proving that even the smallest task could shape survival throughout the year. As evening settles gently across the village, the little garden grows quiet beneath the fading light. Rows of cabbage, beans, onions, and herbs rest peacefully after another day of careful tending. Tomorrow they will continue growing while the family returns to work at sunrise. These humble gardens rarely appeared in stories of kings or battles, yet they quietly sustained millions of ordinary people across medieval Europe for centuries. Every evening, before darkness settled over the village, someone usually walked through the garden one final time. Wilted leaves were removed, young plants were checked, and anything ready for harvest was carefully gathered before the cool night arrived. These quiet moments required no hurry. The garden rewarded those who paid close attention, reminding every peasant that steady care, rather than sudden effort, brought the richest harvests. Rain was welcomed with quiet gratitude, but too much could be just as dangerous as too little. Heavy storms flooded vegetable beds, washed away seeds, and damaged tender roots beneath the soil. During dry summers, families carried bucket after bucket of water by hand to keep their gardens alive. Every changing season tested their patience, teaching them that survival depended upon working with nature instead of trying to control it. Many herbs growing beside the vegetables served more than one purpose. Mint freshened drinking water, sage flavored simple meals, while thyme and rosemary were valued for their pleasant aroma and traditional household uses. Although medieval people lacked scientific knowledge, they trusted these familiar plants because generations before them had done the same. Their gardens quietly blended food, tradition, and everyday wisdom into one peaceful corner of village life. Looking across a medieval kitchen garden today, it may seem surprisingly small. Yet within those narrow rows grew much of the food a family needed throughout the year. Every onion, cabbage, bean, and herb represented hours of patient labor beneath changing skies. These modest gardens rarely attracted attention from kings or chroniclers, but they quietly supported the lives of millions of ordinary people across medieval Europe. As the evening breeze gently moves through the rows of vegetables and fragrant herbs, the garden settles into peaceful silence beneath the fading light. Tomorrow, the family will return to gather another simple harvest before beginning the day's work. Our quiet journey now leaves the cottage garden behind and continues into one of the hardest seasons of medieval life, where long winters tested every family's food stores, endurance, and hope. Imagine waking before sunrise on a freezing winter morning. The fields outside your cottage lie silent beneath frost. No fresh vegetables grow in the garden, and the nearest harvest is still many months away. Inside the house, your family quietly opens the food stores gathered during autumn, hoping they will last until spring. For medieval peasants, winter was not simply a season. It was the greatest yearly test of planning, patience, and survival. As temperatures fell across medieval Europe, daily life changed almost overnight. Farming nearly stopped. Gardens rested beneath frozen soil, and every meal depended upon food preserved during previous months. Each loaf of bread, handful of beans, and piece of salted meat was carefully measured. Families understood that eating too much too early could leave them with nothing before winter finally released its grip on the countryside. The village storehouse became a symbol of hope throughout the cold season. Wooden barrels filled with grain, dried peas, beans, onions, and smoked meat stood waiting inside cool buildings protected from damp weather and hungry animals. Every family checked these supplies regularly, knowing their survival depended upon careful planning. A full storehouse brought quiet confidence, while an empty one filled every household with silent worry. Winter evenings were long and remarkably quiet. Darkness arrived early, encouraging families to gather closely around a warm hearth. While a simple pot of pottage simmered above the fire, parents repaired clothing, grandparents shared old stories, and children listened peacefully beside the glowing flames. These gentle hours strengthened family bonds, reminding everyone that warmth, companionship, and hope were just as valuable as the food upon the table. Not every winter was equally difficult. A mild season allowed precious supplies to last comfortably until spring, but severe cold, heavy snow, or an earlier failed harvest could quickly change everything. Medieval families never knew exactly what the coming months would bring, so they faced each winter with quiet determination. Their greatest protection was neither wealth nor comfort, but careful preparation, patience, and the support of their village community. As winter deepened, every meal became a careful calculation. Families opened their grain sacks slowly, measured dried beans by hand, and sliced smoked meat into the smallest useful portions. Nothing could be wasted because no one knew exactly when fresh food would return. Each supper reflected quiet discipline rather than abundance, teaching every generation that surviving winter depended more upon patience than generous harvests alone. Firewood became almost as valuable as food during the coldest months. Before winter arrived, families spent weeks gathering fallen branches, cutting logs, and stacking them beneath simple shelters to keep them dry. Every piece was burned carefully because an empty woodpile meant freezing nights inside the cottage. The warmth of the hearth protected not only the family, but also the food slowly cooking above the glowing flames. Snow transformed the familiar countryside into a silent white landscape where everyday tasks became slower and more difficult. Narrow paths disappeared beneath deep drifts. Streams froze along their edges, and traveling between villages required far greater effort. Many families remained close to home, relying upon neighbors only when absolutely necessary. Winter encouraged quiet routines, strengthening the importance of preparation made during the warmer months. Inside the cottage, Long evenings created rare opportunities for work that summer rarely allowed. Parents mended clothing, sharpened farming tools, twisted rope, and repaired wooden baskets, while children listened to stories passed down through generations. These peaceful hours reminded everyone that winter was not only a season of hardship, it also became a time for family, tradition, and preparing together for the coming spring. Even during the harshest winters, hope quietly remained alive inside every medieval home. Beneath the frozen fields, seeds waited patiently for warmer days, while stored grain promised another planting season ahead. Families understood that winter, however difficult, would not last forever. That quiet confidence helped them face each cold morning, believing that spring would eventually return and the earth would once again provide its generous harvest. Not every family entered winter with enough supplies. A failed harvest, sick livestock, or weeks of heavy rain during autumn could leave storage rooms nearly empty before the first snowfall arrived. In those difficult years, every meal became smaller than the last. Parents quietly reduced their own portions so children could eat first, making silent sacrifices that were rarely recorded in history but repeated across countless medieval villages. Neighbors often became one another's greatest source of strength during severe winters. Families shared firewood, exchanged small amounts of grain, or helped repair damaged roofs after heavy storms. These acts were rarely grand or celebrated, yet they quietly strengthened entire communities. Medieval survival depended not only upon individual preparation, but also upon trust, cooperation, and the willingness to help others when hardship reached every doorstep. Inside the cottage, thick-wool blankets, animal skins, and carefully woven clothing provided precious protection against the bitter cold. Windows were small, doors were tightly secured, and every gap allowing icy air inside was stuffed with straw or cloth. Even so, mornings often began with frost forming on the inside walls. Enduring such conditions required remarkable resilience, patience, and acceptance of winter's quiet challenges. The family hearth became the true heart of the medieval home throughout winter. It warmed chilled hands, cooked simple meals, dried damp clothing, and filled the cottage with comforting light long after darkness covered the fields. Around its gentle flames, stories were told, prayers were whispered, and tomorrow's work was quietly planned. More than any other place inside the home, the hearth offered warmth, hope, and togetherness. As another cold evening settles across the sleeping countryside, the wind softly brushes against the wooden cottage while glowing embers slowly fade beneath the cooking pot. Inside, the family rests peacefully, trusting the careful preparations made months before. Though winter still holds the land in silence, they know each passing day carries them one step closer to spring, when green fields and fresh harvests will quietly return once again. By late winter, the food stores often looked noticeably smaller than they had only weeks before. Grain sacks felt lighter, barrels of beans slowly emptied, and smoked meat became increasingly rare. Yet families resisted the temptation to eat freely. They understood that the most difficult weeks often arrived just before spring. Careful patience during these final days frequently determined whether everyone would remain healthy until the first new crops appeared. The first signs of spring brought quiet excitement throughout the village. Tiny green shoots pushed through the frozen earth, Birds returned to familiar trees, and longer daylight hinted that winter's grip was finally weakening. Although little fresh food was ready to harvest, these gentle changes lifted weary spirits. After months of cold and careful rationing, even the smallest sign of new life renewed hope inside every medieval household. Looking back today, it is easy to admire castles, knights, and grand cathedrals. Yet the true victory of medieval winter belonged to ordinary families. Without wealth or luxury, they survived through careful planning, hard work, and quiet determination. Every spring they reached represented another triumph over hunger, bitter weather, and uncertainty. Their greatest achievement was not comfort, but simply enduring together until warmer days returned once again. Winter taught lessons that remained with medieval children throughout their lives. They learned never to waste food, never to ignore the changing seasons, and never to underestimate the value of preparation. These habits became traditions passed from one generation to the next. Long before written instructions filled books, survival itself became the teacher, quietly shaping everyday life through experience rather than words. Now the last snow slowly melts beneath the gentle warmth of early spring, and the quiet village begins to awaken once more. Gardens will soon be planted, fields prepared, and fresh food will gradually replace the carefully guarded winter stores. As our peaceful journey continues, we leave the cold months behind and step into another fascinating chapter, exploring how medieval peasants celebrated the rare feast days that brought joy, music, and extraordinary meals to village life. Imagine waking to the cheerful sound of church bells echoing across a peaceful medieval village. Today feels different. The fields can wait, tools remain untouched, and smiles appear more easily than usual. Families put on their cleanest clothes while the rich aroma of special meals drifts gently through the cool morning air. After months of hard labor, a rare feast day has finally arrived, bringing joy, rest, and precious moments shared with neighbors. For medieval peasants, feast days were far more than simple holidays. They offered a welcome pause from endless farming, allowing families to gather without worrying about the next day's work. Religious festivals, harvest celebrations, weddings, and village fairs fill the calendar with rare moments of happiness. These occasions reminded everyone that even the hardest life deserved moments of laughter, gratitude, and peaceful celebration shared together. Food played a special role during every celebration. Fresh bread, roasted meat when available, sweet honey, cheese, and freshly brewed ale appeared on tables more generously than during ordinary days. Children watched eagerly as familiar meals gave way to rare treats they had anticipated for weeks. Every bite carried a sense of gratitude, making these simple feasts unforgettable long after the celebration quietly came to an end. Music soon filled the village square as simple flutes, drums, fiddles, and cheerful voices echoed through the air. Young and old joined hands in traditional dances while children laughed and chased one another between the cottages. These joyful gatherings required no grand stage or expensive entertainment. Instead, they celebrated community itself, bringing neighbors together after countless weeks spent working separately across the surrounding fields. As daylight slowly faded, bonfires lit the evening with a warm golden glow. Families lingered together, sharing stories, songs, and quiet conversation beneath the open sky, while the last pieces of special food disappeared from wooden tables. Tomorrow, ordinary work would begin again, but tonight belonged to celebration. These rare moments of peace reminded medieval peasants that joy often arrived not through wealth, but through togetherness, gratitude, and shared tradition. Village fairs often accompanied important feast days, bringing merchants from nearby towns with goods rarely seen during ordinary weeks. Colorful cloth, handmade pottery, wooden toys, spices, and simple jewelry attracted curious crowds. Children wandered from stall to stall with wide eyes while adults carefully examined useful tools or household items. These lively markets briefly transformed quiet villages into places filled with conversation, discovery, and excitement. Storytellers and traveling musicians also became welcome guests during many celebrations. Gathering beside the village square, they entertained listeners with tales of brave knights, distant kingdoms, clever animals, and remarkable adventures. For families who rarely traveled beyond neighboring villages, these stories opened small windows into a much larger world. As evening approached, their gentle voices blended with music, creating memories that lingered long after the festival ended. Children eagerly waited for feast days because they offered freedom from ordinary routines. Instead of gathering firewood or helping in the fields, they played running games, tossed handmade balls, and laughed together beneath the open sky. Parents smiled as they watched, knowing such carefree moments appeared only a few times each year. Even simple games became treasured memories that brightened the long months of hard work between celebrations. Religious ceremonies remained at the heart of most medieval festivals. Villagers gathered inside the local church to offer prayers of gratitude before returning outdoors to share meals and conversation. Faith shaped nearly every celebration, reminding people that harvests, healthy families, and peaceful seasons were blessings to appreciate together. These quiet moments of reflection gave deeper meaning to the joyful feast that followed throughout the day. As twilight slowly settled across the village, music softened, laughter faded, and families began their peaceful walk home beneath the evening sky. Tomorrow the fields would once again demand hard work, yet tonight's celebration left every heart a little lighter. These rare feast days offered more than food or entertainment. They renewed hope, strengthened friendships, and reminded ordinary peasants that even the hardest lives still held moments of simple happiness. Harvest festivals held a special place in every medieval village because they marked the successful end of months of exhausting labor. Fields that had demanded endless effort now stood empty, while barns filled with grain promised hope for the coming winter. Families gathered with grateful hearts, sharing simple meals, songs, and quiet laughter. These celebrations honored not wealth or power, but the hard work that had carried the entire community through another growing season. Wedding feasts brought another rare opportunity for celebration. Neighbors contributed bread, cheese, ale, vegetables, or whatever they could spare, helping the new couple begin married life surrounded by generosity. Music echoed through the village while children played beneath colorful ribbons hanging from nearby trees. Though the meals remained modest by noble standards, the joy shared that day often became one of the happiest memories in a peasant's lifetime. As darkness covered the countryside, Lanterns and glowing fires illuminated the village with a soft golden light. Music gradually slowed. Conversations became quieter, and tired children rested beside their parents after a day filled with excitement. The peaceful atmosphere carried a comforting feeling rarely found during ordinary working days, reminding everyone that rest itself was a gift worth celebrating alongside food and friendship. Even elderly villagers looked forward to feast days, not because of rich food alone, but because they offered precious moments to gather with children, grandchildren, and lifelong friends. Stories from decades past were shared beside warm fires as younger generations listened with quiet fascination. These peaceful evenings strengthened family traditions, allowing memories to pass gently from one generation to the next without the need for written records. When the final song faded into the cool night air, families quietly returned to their cottages carrying warm memories rather than expensive treasures. Tomorrow the familiar rhythm of farming would begin once again, yet the joy of the festival lingered within every heart. These simple celebrations gave medieval peasants something precious beyond food, a reason to hope, to laugh together, and to face another season with renewed strength and quiet gratitude. As the celebration drew to a close, families carefully gathered the remaining bread, cheese, and roasted vegetables to carry home. Nothing was left behind or wasted, because tomorrow ordinary life would return. The cheerful songs slowly faded into quiet conversation as neighbors wished one another good health before walking beneath the stars. Even the simplest feast ended with the same practical wisdom that shaped everyday medieval life. For children, these festivals became treasured memories that lasted far beyond the season itself. Long after the music ended, they remembered the laughter, colorful ribbons, sweet honey cakes, and stories shared around the evening fire. Years later, those same children would tell similar stories to their own families. In this quiet way, tradition survived not through books, but through joyful moments carefully remembered across generations. As the village gradually fell silent, only the soft crackling of fading bonfires and the distant ringing of church bells remained. The celebration had ended, yet its warmth lingered in every cottage. Tomorrow would once again bring hard work, muddy fields, and simple meals, but tonight every family carried home a peaceful reminder that even difficult lives could be brightened by kindness, music, and shared celebration. Looking back today, these humble festivals reveal something deeply human that has changed very little over the centuries. People gathered not because they possessed great wealth, but because they valued friendship, gratitude, faith, and time spent together. Their celebrations remind us that happiness often grows from ordinary moments shared with others, rather than from luxury or comfort. That quiet truth still feels familiar even in our modern world. Now the last lantern is gently extinguished. The village square grows peaceful once more, and families rest quietly before another sunrise. The songs have faded, the tables stand empty, and the stars shine above the sleeping countryside. As our calm journey continues, we leave these joyful celebrations behind and step into the final chapter, where we discover what the everyday diet of medieval peasants can still teach us about resilience, gratitude, and simple living today. Imagine sitting down beside a medieval peasant family just as the evening meal begins. The wooden bowls are filled, fresh bread rests upon the table, and the fire glows warmly in the corner. Yet something feels strangely missing. There are no potatoes, no tomatoes, no corn, no chocolate, and no steaming cup of coffee. Many foods we consider ordinary today simply did not exist in medieval Europe, making every meal surprisingly different from our own. Potatoes now feed millions across Europe and America. Yet medieval peasants had never seen one. The potato originally grew high in the Andes Mountains of South America and would not reach Europe until centuries after the Middle Ages. For medieval families, filling meals depended instead on bread, beans, cabbage, turnips, onions, and pottage. Their daily survival rested entirely upon crops already growing in European soil. Tomatoes were equally unknown throughout medieval Europe, although they appear in countless modern dishes today. They also arrived from the Americas after the voyages of Christopher Columbus. A medieval cook preparing supper would never have sliced fresh tomatoes into a stew or sauce. Instead, familiar herbs, onions, leeks, and simple vegetables supplied the flavors that shaped everyday meals across villages throughout the countryside. Corn, known today as maize, was another food completely absent from medieval tables. Native peoples across the Americas had cultivated it for thousands of years, yet European peasants knew nothing of its golden fields or sweet kernels. Their grain harvests depended almost entirely upon wheat, barley, oats, and rye. These traditional crops filled village barns each autumn, becoming bread, porridge, and ale that sustained families throughout the year. Perhaps the greatest surprise of all is that medieval peasants had never tasted chocolate. Cacao trees grew far across the Atlantic in Central America, where ancient civilizations prepared rich chocolate drinks long before Europeans arrived. Inside a medieval cottage, no sweet chocolate desserts or warm cocoa existed. Instead, honey remained the most treasured natural sweetener, adding rare moments of sweetness to an otherwise simple and humble daily diet. A medieval breakfast also looked remarkably different without coffee or tea. Neither drink had yet reached European villages. Instead, families often began the morning with small ale, fresh water from trusted springs, or buttermilk when available. Warm pottage left from the previous evening was commonly reheated above the fire. These simple choices provided enough strength for another demanding day without the beverages many people now consider essential. Oranges, lemons, and other tropical fruits were rare treasures that ordinary peasants almost never encountered. Growing in distant lands with warmer climates, they remained beyond the reach of most villages. Instead, apples, pears, plums, blackberries, and hazelnuts filled local orchards and forests. Medieval families built their meals around foods the surrounding countryside willingly provided rather than distant luxuries carried across dangerous trade routes. White sugar was another luxury almost entirely absent from peasant life. Produced from sugarcane grown in warmer regions, it remained extremely expensive throughout much of the Middle Ages. When families desired something sweet, they turned instead to honey gathered from local beehives. A spoonful of honey stirred into porridge or spread across fresh bread transformed an ordinary meal into a rare and memorable treat for the entire household. Rice existed in parts of Europe, yet few peasants ever placed it upon their tables. Transporting rice across long distances made it costly, limiting its use to wealthier households or special occasions in certain regions. Most villagers relied instead on familiar grains like oats, barley, rye, and wheat. These dependable harvests formed the foundation of bread, porridge, and ale that sustained everyday life across medieval Europe. Looking at a modern supermarket, a medieval peasant would likely feel amazed by the endless variety of foods from every corner of the world. Their own meals depended almost entirely upon local fields, forests, gardens, and nearby rivers. Yet despite having far fewer choices, they learned to prepare nourishing meals through patience, careful planning, and deep respect for every ingredient that nature quietly placed within their reach. Bananas, pineapples, and many other tropical fruits were completely unknown to medieval peasants. These plants grew in distant climates beyond the imagination of most European villagers. A peasant child could spend an entire lifetime without ever seeing such fruits. Instead, each season offered familiar harvests of apples, pears, berries, and hazelnuts, teaching families to appreciate the simple gifts their own countryside provided. Modern kitchens overflow with spices collected from around the world. Yet most medieval peasants relied upon herbs growing only a few steps from their cottages. Parsley, sage, thyme, mint, dill, and fennel flavored daily meals, while costly spices like cinnamon, cloves, and black pepper remained rare luxuries reserved for wealthy households. Local gardens, rather than distant trade routes, supplied the taste that defined ordinary village cooking. Without refrigerators, canned foods, or frozen meals, every ingredient had to be eaten fresh or carefully preserved. Vegetables were stored in cool cellars, meat was salted or smoked, and grains were protected inside wooden bins throughout the winter. Every season shaped what appeared upon the table. Medieval families naturally accepted this rhythm, understanding that nature itself determined the menu far more than personal preference. Looking across today's colorful supermarkets, it is difficult to imagine choosing meals from only a handful of familiar foods. Yet medieval peasants rarely considered their diet unusual, because everyone around them lived in much the same way. Their expectations were shaped by the seasons rather than endless choice. Contentment often came from having enough to eat, not from enjoying countless varieties of food from distant lands. As another peaceful evening settles over the quiet village, the wooden table holds only foods gathered from nearby fields, gardens, forests, and rivers. Though simple by modern standards, every meal reflects generations of practical knowledge and careful planning. Our gentle journey now moves toward its final chapter, where we discover the timeless lessons that the humble diet of medieval peasants still offers to our busy modern lives. If a medieval peasant suddenly walked into a modern grocery store, the greatest surprise would not be the size of the building, but the endless variety of food. Shelves filled with tropical fruits, chocolate, coffee, soft drinks, and packaged meals would seem almost impossible to understand. Their own lives revolved around only a handful of local foods, carefully gathered and preserved through the changing seasons with remarkable patience. Yet despite having far fewer choices, medieval families rarely expected anything different. They ate what their fields produced, what nearby forests offered, and what careful planning allowed them to preserve. Their meals reflected the landscape surrounding them rather than distant countries. This close relationship with nature shaped not only their diet, but also their understanding of time, gratitude, and the changing rhythm of every season. Many of today's favorite foods reached Europe only after great voyages connected continents that had remained separated for thousands of years. Potatoes, tomatoes, corn, chocolate, and many other familiar ingredients completely transformed European cooking in later centuries. Medieval peasants lived before those remarkable exchanges began, making their tables a fascinating glimpse into an older world shaped entirely by local harvests and traditional knowledge. Looking back across history, the absence of these familiar foods reminds us how quickly everyday life can change. What feels ordinary today once seemed unimaginable, while the humble meals of medieval villages sustained countless generations without modern comforts. Their simple diet tells a quiet story of adaptation, resilience, and respect for the land that provided everything needed to survive another changing season. Now the evening meal has ended, the wooden bowls have been quietly cleared away, and only the gentle glow of the hearth remains inside the peaceful cottage. Outside, the stars shine above fields that have fed generations with simple harvests alone. As our calm journey approaches its final chapter, we leave the medieval table behind and discover the enduring lessons these humble meals still offer to our modern world. Imagine sitting quietly inside the same humble cottage one final evening. The wooden table holds nothing extravagant, only dark bread, warm pottage, a few vegetables, and perhaps a little cheese. By modern standards, the meal seems incredibly simple, yet for the family gathered around the glowing hearth, it represents another successful day of survival. As our journey nears its end, we discover the timeless lessons hidden within these ordinary meals. The medieval peasant's table teaches us that abundance is not always measured by variety. Most families eat the same familiar foods throughout much of the year, yet every meal carried quiet meaning because it reflected months of hard work. Bread, vegetables, herbs, and careful planning transformed simple harvests into daily survival. Their greatest wealth was often the confidence that tomorrow's meal was already waiting in the storehouse. Nothing was wasted inside a medieval household. Leftover bread became tomorrow's soup. Vegetable scraps returned to the cooking pot, and animal bones simmered into nourishing broth. Every resource found another purpose before finally disappearing. This remarkable habit of careful use was not simply tradition, it was a practical way of life that allowed ordinary families to survive uncertain harvests and long, demanding winters year after year. The changing seasons shaped every decision a medieval family made. Spring meant planting, summer demanded endless labor, autumn rewarded careful effort, and winter tested every prepared store. Rather than resisting these natural rhythms, peasants quietly accepted them. Their daily lives remind us that patience often brings greater rewards than haste, and that nature has always remained the true keeper of every successful harvest. Perhaps the greatest lesson of all is gratitude. Medieval peasants rarely expected luxury or endless choice. A warm meal beside loved ones, a successful harvest, and enough food to reach another spring were blessings worth celebrating. Their quiet contentment invites us to pause and appreciate the simple comforts surrounding us today. Sometimes history whispers its greatest wisdom through the humblest table, shared by an ordinary family at the close of another peaceful day. Another lesson hidden within the medieval table is patience. Nothing appeared instantly. Bread required months of growing grain before it reached the oven. Cheese depended upon healthy animals and careful preparation. Even a bowl of simple pottage reflected hours of gathering vegetables and tending the fire. Every meal represented countless small efforts, quietly reminding us that life's greatest rewards often arrive only after steady work and time. The peasant family also understood something many people still search for today: strong sense of community. During difficult seasons, neighbors shared seeds, exchanged food, repaired homes, and helped gather harvests together. Their meals were rarely enjoyed in isolation. Around one table, conversation, gratitude, and companionship became as nourishing as the food itself, strengthening relationships that carried entire villages through hardship. Nature remained the greatest teacher in medieval life. Families observed birds returning in spring, changing winds before storms, and the slow ripening of crops beneath the summer sun. Without weather forecasts or scientific instruments, careful observation guided nearly every decision. Their survival depended upon respecting nature's rhythms rather than attempting to overcome them, a quiet wisdom that still speaks gently to the modern world. Although medieval life was undeniably difficult, it also revealed remarkable resilience. Families faced poor harvests, bitter winters, illness, and uncertainty with steady determination rather than despair. They adapted, prepared carefully, and found comfort in simple routines repeated every day. Looking back across the centuries, their quiet perseverance reminds us that strength is often built through ordinary moments patiently lived rather than dramatic victories. As the fire slowly settles into glowing embers, the medieval table grows quiet once more. Empty wooden bowls rest beside rough bread, while the family prepares for another peaceful night's sleep before tomorrow's work begins again. Their simple meal may seem distant from our modern lives, yet its lessons of gratitude, patience, and careful stewardship continue to feel timeless. Our journey now moves gently toward its final reflections. Another quiet lesson from the medieval table is appreciation for ordinary things. A loaf of fresh bread, a bowl of warm soup, or a peaceful evening beside the hearth brought genuine comfort after a demanding day. These simple pleasures were never taken for granted because each required months of labor and careful preparation. Their daily lives remind us that happiness often grows from gratitude rather than endless abundance. The changing seasons taught medieval families to think far beyond the present moment. During plentiful harvests, they quietly prepared for winter instead of consuming everything immediately. Grain was stored, vegetables preserved, and seeds carefully saved for another year. Their future depended upon decisions made long before hardship arrived, revealing a timeless wisdom about planning ahead while times are still gen. Children growing up beside the medieval table learned practical skills almost every day. They watched bread being baked, vegetables harvested, herbs gathered, and food carefully preserved for colder months. These lessons came naturally through observation rather than formal classrooms. By adulthood, they understood that every meal reflected countless small acts of patience, cooperation, and respect for the land that sustained their families. Although centuries separate us from medieval villages, many of their quiet values still feel surprisingly familiar. Families gathering for supper, neighbors helping during difficult times, and gratitude for a successful harvest remain meaningful across cultures today. History reminds us that while technology changes remarkably fast, the simple human need for food, community, and belonging has remained almost unchanged throughout the centuries. As another peaceful evening settles over the countryside, the family quietly finishes its final meal before resting beside the fading fire. Tomorrow will bring familiar work, familiar fields, and another simple supper shared together. Our gentle journey now approaches its closing moments, where we reflect upon how these humble medieval meals continue to offer quiet wisdom, resilience, and gratitude even in the modern world. Looking back across 8 centuries, we discover that the medieval peasant's table was never simply a place to eat. It reflected every season, every harvest, every hardship, and every quiet victory earned through honest labor. Each loaf of bread and bowl of pottage carried a story of patience and resilience. Though humble in appearance, that small wooden table became the heart of family life and the foundation of survival itself. Modern life offers more food than medieval villages could ever have imagined. Yet endless choice does not always bring greater satisfaction. The peasants found joy in sharing simple meals, caring for one another, and respecting the gifts of each harvest. Their quiet routines remind us that contentment often grows from appreciation rather than abundance, and from slowing down long enough to value ordinary moments together. As our peaceful journey gently comes to an end, the little cottage grows quiet beneath the evening sky. The fire settles into glowing embers, wooden bowls rest upon the table, and tomorrow's bread waits patiently beside the hearth. Outside, the fields sleep beneath the stars, preparing for another sunrise. Life will continue just as it has for generations, guided by nature, patience, and quiet determination. Perhaps that is why the story of medieval peasants still feels meaningful today. Behind every simple meal stood courage, careful planning, and hope for another season. Their lives remind us that history is not remembered only through kings or battles, but also through ordinary families who quietly shape the world by planting seeds, sharing food, raising children, and facing each new day with steady hearts. Now the village has fallen completely silent. The last candle flickers softly before fading into darkness, while a gentle breeze passes across the empty fields beyond the cottage. Thank you for joining this quiet journey into the everyday meals of medieval peasants. May these peaceful stories remain with you as you relax, drift into restful sleep, and dream of another gentle walk through the distant past. Imagine standing quietly beside the empty medieval table after everyone has gone to sleep. The fire has faded into soft embers. The wooden bowls have been washed, and tomorrow's loaf rests beneath a linen cloth. Nothing here appears extraordinary, yet this humble room has sustained generations through countless seasons. Tonight we explore the quiet legacy these ordinary families unknowingly left behind for the modern world. The greatest inheritance of medieval peasants was not castles, riches, or famous victories. It was practical knowledge passed from parent to child through everyday life. They taught one another when to plant seeds, how to preserve food, where to find clean water, and how to survive difficult winters. These quiet lessons, repeated over centuries, became the foundation upon which later farming communities continued to build. Many traditions still practiced in rural communities today have surprisingly deep medieval roots. Saving seeds for another season, sharing harvests with neighbors, baking bread at home, and gathering around one table remain familiar customs across many parts of the world. Although centuries have passed, these simple habits continue to remind us that community and cooperation have always been among humanity's greatest strengths. The medieval cottage also teaches us that comfort does not always depend upon luxury. A warm fire, dependable food, familiar voices, and a safe place to rest brought peace after long days of labor. Though their lives were undeniably difficult, these small comforts carried enormous meaning. They remind us that true security often begins with the simple necessities shared among family and trusted friends. As another gentle evening settles across the quiet countryside, the cottage stands peacefully beneath the stars. Tomorrow will bring familiar work, familiar meals, and another ordinary day that future generations may never record in history books. Yet it is precisely these quiet moments, repeated countless times across centuries, that shaped the everyday lives of millions and quietly influenced the world that followed. One of the greatest lessons medieval peasants quietly passed to future generations was the importance of self-reliance. Families grew much of their own food, repaired their own tools, baked their own bread, and made clothing from materials close at hand. Every useful skill strengthened the household. Their daily routines remind us that confidence often grows through learning practical abilities rather than depending upon distant conveniences. The land itself became a trusted companion throughout every stage of life. Children learned to recognize changing seasons by watching trees, birds, and growing crops rather than calendars. Adults understood which fields rested, which streams remained clean, and where wild berries could safely be gathered. This close relationship with nature shaped every decision, creating a quiet harmony between people and the landscape surrounding them. Meals were never hurried inside a medieval cottage. After long hours of work, families gathered around the wooden table, shared simple food, exchanged stories, and prepared for tomorrow together. These peaceful evenings strengthened relationships as much as they restored tired bodies. In a world without constant distractions, conversation beside the hearth became one of the day's greatest comforts and most treasured traditions. Looking across the centuries, the greatest achievement of ordinary peasants was not extraordinary wealth or lasting fame. It was their remarkable ability to continue, season after season, despite uncertainty and hardship. Every successful harvest, every loaf of bread, and every peaceful evening beside the fire represented quiet victories that allowed families and entire communities to endure through generations of changing history. As darkness gently settles over the sleeping village, another ordinary day quietly comes to an end. The fields rest beneath the stars, the hearth glows softly, and tomorrow's work patiently awaits with the sunrise. These simple routines may seem distant from modern life, yet they continue to remind us that resilience, gratitude, and steady effort often leave the deepest legacy of all. The medieval table reminds us that wealth was often measured differently than it is today. A healthy harvest, a sturdy roof before winter, strong family relationships, and enough food to share with a neighbor represented true prosperity. These quiet achievements rarely appeared in royal chronicles, yet they carried enormous value for ordinary people whose greatest hope was simply another peaceful season together. Generations of medieval children inherited more than land or simple tools. They received stories, traditions, farming knowledge, recipes, and practical wisdom repeated around the evening fire. Without printed books or formal schools, experience became the greatest teacher. Every season added another lesson, ensuring valuable knowledge continued flowing naturally from grandparents to parents and finally into the hands of the youngest generation. Even today, many people find comfort in activities that would have felt familiar inside a medieval cottage. Baking fresh bread, tending a garden, gathering family for supper, or watching rain fall across quiet fields connects us to rhythms that have existed for centuries. Though the modern world has changed beyond recognition, these peaceful routines still offer a timeless sense of belonging and quiet satisfaction. History often celebrates powerful rulers and famous battles, yet countless unnamed peasants quietly shaped civilization through their daily work. They cultivated the fields, preserved seeds, raised families, and produced the harvests that supported entire kingdoms. Their names may have disappeared from history, but their patient labor became the unseen foundation upon which medieval society continued to survive and grow through the centuries. As another peaceful evening settles over the quiet countryside, the familiar cottage rests beneath a sky filled with stars. Tomorrow's bread has already been prepared. Tomorrow's work patiently awaits, and another ordinary day will quietly unfold. In these simple routines lies the true legacy of medieval life, reminding us that history is often written not only by extraordinary people, but by millions of ordinary families living with patience and hope. If there is one lasting message from the medieval peasant's table, it is that an ordinary life can leave an extraordinary legacy. Every seed planted, every loaf baked, and every meal shared helps sustain families through uncertain years. These quiet actions were repeated by millions whose names are now forgotten, yet together they shaped the daily rhythm of medieval Europe more than any king ever could. The peaceful routines of medieval cottages remind us that life's greatest treasures often cannot be counted or purchased. Trust between neighbors, laughter around the evening fire, the smell of fresh bread, and the comfort of returning safely home after a long day's work gave lasting happiness. Across the centuries, these simple moments continue to feel familiar because the human heart has changed far less than the world around it. As night settles gently across the countryside, every cottage becomes quiet beneath the stars. The fields rest peacefully until sunrise, while tomorrow's work waits patiently beyond the horizon. Inside, families sleep knowing they have done everything possible to prepare for another day. Their calm acceptance of life's natural rhythm offers a gentle reminder that peace often begins with appreciating enough rather than seeking more. Perhaps the greatest gift these ordinary villagers leave us is perspective. Their world contained few comforts by modern standards, yet they found meaning through family, honest labor, shared meals, and hope carried from one season to the next. Looking back upon their lives encourages us to slow our own pace, notice simple blessings, And remember that contentment has never depended entirely upon material abundance. Now our quiet walk through the medieval countryside gently comes to its close. The cottage grows still, the fire fades into its final glowing embers, and a peaceful silence settles across the sleeping fields. Thank you for spending this gentle journey through history. May these timeless stories of simple living, quiet resilience, and humble meals remain with you as the night grows deeper and restful sleep peacefully arrives. Imagine returning one final time to the small medieval cottage where our journey first began. Evening has quietly settled across the countryside. The day's work is finished, and a simple meal waits upon the familiar wooden table. Nothing has changed except our understanding. What once seemed like an ordinary supper now tells a remarkable story of patience, resilience, and quiet determination carried across countless generations of forgotten families. The warm loaf of bread resting beside the cooking pot is more than food. It carries the memory of autumn harvests, careful planting, patient waiting, and countless hours of honest labor beneath changing skies. Every slice reminds us that survival was never accidental. It was earned through quiet persistence repeated every season, year after year, by ordinary people whose names history rarely remembered. Around this modest table, children learn their first lessons about gratitude, responsibility, and kindness. Parents quietly demonstrated that every crumb mattered, every harvest deserved respect, and every shared meal strengthened the family. Without realizing it, these everyday moments shape future generations. Long before schools or printed books became common, wisdom often traveled through simple conversations beside the evening fire. Outside the cottage, the fields now rest beneath a peaceful blanket of moonlight. Tomorrow they will once again welcome hardworking hands carrying seeds, tools, and quiet hope for another growing season. The rhythm never truly ends. Generation follows generation, each leaving behind small traces of care and perseverance. In this gentle cycle, the countryside quietly preserves memories that written history often overlooks. As the final meal slowly comes to an end, silence gently fills the little cottage once more. The wooden bowls are placed aside, the fire settles into glowing embers, and sleepy voices fade into the calm evening. Our long journey through medieval life is almost complete. Before we quietly say goodbye, there are still a few timeless lessons waiting to be discovered beneath the peaceful night sky. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey through history. I hope these peaceful stories helped you relax and gently drift towards sleep. If you enjoyed spending this time together, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed for more calm journeys into the past. Until next time, rest well, sleep peacefully, and may your dreams carry you gently through history. Good night.